like a load-bearing blank. It's like a timer. Thank God. Jose's like, no. Oh yeah, it actually goes well with the. All right, guys, we are going to get started, so find a seat. Just like with any of our events, we want to really thank you guys for coming out. There's lots of things you could do in this crazy city on a Thursday night, and you have chosen to be here to talk about a 125-year-old tech. So I appreciate you guys being here. We have a little bit of housekeeping. Like I said, if you guys need to use the restroom, if you weren't here earlier, straight back to the left. We do have water up here at the front where our volunteer gauge is. And then also we have a glossary that is kind of connected to the presentation and to the rest of the weeks that we're going to be doing. So if you haven't picked that up, that's at the front table. We have copies of what is to be done. And we also, you can also access the text through Marxist.org if you're good reading from a phone or a laptop. So once again, welcome. My name is Joe. I am one of the volunteers and an educator here at All Power, and I'm joined with my comrade Josh.
Hi everyone, I'm Josh. I'm part of the steering committee here at All Power Books and part of the political education committee. Super excited to be here with y'all tonight.
Josh also does he kind of curates our cinema club. So if you guys are into cinema, into kind of watching film that maybe from a leftist perspective and like to watch stuff with comrades on a Friday night, feel free to join us. We've had a really good time with that. Josh does a great job putting that together. So that's just another little thing that we do here at All Power. So you have anything else to add on that?
No, that's all.
Okay, good deal. Okay, so this is the first week of What is to be Done. So this question, what is to be done, is probably a question that a lot of us are asking these days, right? So it's, this last 12 months has been especially hectic, especially if you ever have the misfortune of opening up that apocalyptic doomscape that is our collective social media feed. We have a lot of bad shit going on. So I think there's a lot of anxiety and a lot of just confusion about the way the world is. So I think a lot of people are asking, what is to be done? So we hope through this class and through reading together as a group that we're going to start to answer that question little by little to see what actually is to be done. So we have a lot to go through in this introductory class, which we will jump into shortly. But before we do, I wanted to kind of set the stage for the night, set some expectations for the objectives of the class and the study as a whole, and also talk about this class in particular and maybe how it's going to differ from the rest of the week. So let's first talk about the objectives of the class. So this class, we want to kind of help you guys understand, what is to be done in its original context and historical background. That's going to be a lot of what this class is about. We also want you to recognize major themes and ideas of the text and why they are important. And we want you to be able to apply Lenin's ideas and criticism to our real world conditions with an emphasis on how they affect our organizing today, okay? So gives us a little bit of a background as far as what we are doing here in the class for the next few weeks. Now, with the class tonight, it's going to be a little bit different than the rest of the weeks. So tonight, our goal is kind of twofold. What we want to do is we want to explain the development of Marxism leading up to the writing of What is to be Done. Because remember, the time period that was written, like Marx had really just passed away. Engels died 7 years before this was published. So all of this development was still very recent, and we want to kind of help contextualize all the stuff that was going on from Marx's time and to the writing of this. And then in the second half of the presentation, Josh is going to talk about the man himself and his background behind the writing and give you a little bit more insight into Lenin's life himself. And then at the very end, we're going to go through the glossary real quick, just clarify any questions that you still might have, and then we'll have kind of a brief discussion, kind of get to know each other, and start building on the study from there. Now, the following weeks are going to be a little different. We obviously expect that you're reading along with us, but the format will be, different than this week. In those weeks, the teacher of the class will give a brief summary of the text, some of the important points, and then you, the readers, are essentially going to kind of take it from there. These classes are going to be more discussion-based. If you attended our Read Like a Revolutionary class, this is the idea we're trying to promote and build, is this Marxist idea of knowledge and education. The idea that true education is a social and community-driven project, that none of us can know everything on our own, and we really depend on others and the benefit of insight of other people and to be able to develop our broadest and most complete forms of knowledge. And that's how we build through community. So in short, we need you here, we need you guys locked in, and we need you ready to take the interesting things you've learned and the questions that you have and work them out with your comrades in real time. Okay, so that's a big picture of the class. Everybody feel good about that? Any questions about logistics for class? Good. Okay, so now let's talk about Marxism in, they put the other slide up. We'll talk about Marxism in development. Okay, so one thing that I want to kind of help us understand and maybe demystify a little bit is that Lenin was a brilliant person, but he was not a prophet, right? This text didn't drop down from Karl Marx heaven, and it wasn't revealed to Lenin in a dream. But much like everything else, this text developed and arose out of a very specific historical context, which is what we're going to be talking about shortly. And so with this in mind, I've got a little bit of a good news, bad news situation. The bad news is that this isn't like a recipe for revolution. It's not like Lenin opened it up. It's like step 1, start a party. Step 2, buy a dope-ass suit. Step 3, boom, you got revolution. Like, it's not that simple. But the good news side of that, I think, is actually the good news of Marxism, is that that's kind of the point. Marxism is a scientific approach to socialism, right? We wouldn't expect that what worked for comrades in Tsarist Russia over 100 years ago is what should be working and what we should be applying to our circumstance now. Anytime you have a copy and paste solution, it's typically wrong. Unfortunately, correct solutions are oftentimes more complicated and take a little bit more insight. So that's why we're doing all of this study together. If you guys have taken any of my classes or heard me talk about it before, we are going to dive into the historical background and help us understand what the historical circumstance is, because Marxism can be applied to all kinds of situations. And if you don't want to take my word for it, you can listen to the man himself. Lenin talks about this as well. So Lenin said, regarding Marxism, he said, "We do not consider the theory of Marx to be a complete, immutable whole. We think on the contrary that this theory has only laid the cornerstone of the science, a science which socialists must further develop in all directions if they do not want to let themselves be overtaken by life." So part of our goal here is to help us understand the science of Marxism and for us not to be overtaken by the circumstances of life, which is very much feels like we are going through today. Okay, so as social scientists, when it comes to history, we have to decide how far back we want to go, what we want to study, all that good stuff. So we're going to join our heroes in 1850. Now, around this time, our boys Marx and Engels had just published a little pamphlet you might have heard of called the Communist Manifesto. From there, Marx set out on a path to help the world understand how and why capitalism developed and the roots of its kind of like internal problems. This effort would become the text which was kind of the pinnacle of his life work, Capital. Now, as they were developing this idea, the socialists in Europe realized something, okay? That a problematic international system like capitalism needed an international solution. So that international solution became what later became known as the First International, but was originally called the International Workmen's Association. So this group had a few goals, okay? The goal was they sought to address capitalism as an international problem, right? So a system that goes across borders, that crosses freely amongst the working class, needs to have a coordinated and international solution. They prioritize class struggle and working class issues over concerns of individual nations, okay? So thinking about the working class as a whole, not just in your individual nation state. Karl Marx also played a central leadership role in this organization, so he was writing a lot of the documentation, a lot of the bylaws. He was on the leadership team. And this initial kind of working out of left-wing working class politics also was trying to hash out some early divisions in the left-wing movement. So, all right. So we've got this group. They're built basically to help the workers, organize, like I said, across borders, and to think about the system of exploitation beyond just their own country. And this is something Lenin obviously is going to pick up on. So we're not going to spend a lot of time with the First International, except to say that a few important debates were hashed out here. The main one being the debate between the communist and the anarchist, or you could say state versus non-state socialists. Now, important to this debate wasn't just the role of the state and how it should be used. It was also about tactics. The anarchists believed in something called propaganda of the deed, which essentially is isolated acts of violence committed by a small, dedicated group that hope to spur on the masses to revolt and overthrow the system. Think something like Luigi Mangione. Think about burning the warehouse in Ontario, but a little bit more of like an organization behind those type of actions. Okay, so this is important to our reading of what is to be done because it's something Lenin also had to deal with in his day, this idea of terrorism as a tactic. And it actually really personally affected his life, which is something Josh is going to talk about later on. So the other debates around the First International, revolved around kind of the role of the party, how to organize the masses, and this is all stuff that Lenin is going to touch on in this text. So tab all that for later. Eventually, this group kind of, the communist position won out in the group, and the group dissolved after the Paris Commune, which we unfortunately don't have a lot of time to talk about, but it is an amazing historical event. If it's not something you've looked into, please come up to one of us after. We can give you some recommended reading. Lenin actually talks about it a pretty good deal in State and Revolution, but that's beyond the scope of this class, unfortunately. So, from there, after the dissolution of the First International, there was a bit of a dead period for international socialism in Europe. Individual countries continued to struggle, of course, but continue their labor struggle. But the strongest organization that emerged during this time was the Social Democratic Party of Germany, or the SPD, which is still around today. It's the Sozialdemokratische Partei Deutschlands. I practiced that. Josh told me I should give it a try. So yeah, here you go. Everybody clap. Thank you. So these are the guys basically kind of leading the charge of socialism at the end of the 18th century. I try to put kind of little timestamps on here to kind of help us situate ourselves at where we are. So they were the largest socialist party in Europe at the time of writing What Is to Be Done. They were a funny kind of thing. They were formally banned in Germany, Prussia during the 1880s, at which time from 1880 to 1890, they doubled in size but during the time they were being banned. So so Otto von Bismarck basically said, actually, we're not going to ban you guys. That was a bad idea. Many people, including Lenin, saw them as the most likely party to lead the revolution. It was a country that was industrializing faster than just about every country in Europe. This party was extremely radical, was extremely far-reaching, and so Lenin and a lot of socialists during that time saw it as kind of the vanguard, if you will, of the socialist movement. So these guys are leading the charge, but something strange was going on in the world. So Marx kind of thought that the internal contradictions of capitalism would continue to squeeze the workers until they just couldn't take it anymore and revolted, right? So this was why some revolutionaries saw revolution basically as like an inevitability, right? This is kind of a mechanical view of Marxism. Revolution was going to happen no matter what. However, during the 1880s and beyond, capitalism in the core countries kind of started to stabilize. And so working conditions began to improve, due in large part to, of course, unions and socialist parties, but people started making more money, winning more rights, and core capitalist countries continued to get richer and richer. So a bit of a sneak peek, kind of spoiler alert, we know now the reason for this was that the capitalist system began to expand out and push its exploitation outward onto its colonial and imperialized territories, right? So it's not that the extreme exploitation and misery disappeared, it was that it just got pushed out to other parts of the world. And the workers in capitalist Europe especially directly benefited from this trade-off, creating the illusion of a system that worked for everyone. This was, something that even the capitalists saw as a necessary pressure valve, and this is something that this guy, Cecil Rhodes, pointed out. If you took our imperialism class, or if you've read Imperialism, the Highest Stage of Capitalism, you'll recognize this quote. But Cecil Rhodes was a British imperialist, a white supremacist, a pretty bad dude all the way around. But this was his observation at the end of the 18th century. He said, I was in the East End of London, a working class quarter yesterday, and attended a meeting of the unemployed. I listened to the wild speeches, which were just a cry for bread, bread. And on my way home, I pondered over the scene, and I became more than ever convinced of the importance of imperialism. My cherished idea is a solution of for the social problem, i.e., in order to save the 400 million or the 40 million inhabitants of the United Kingdom from a bloody civil war, we colonial statesmen must acquire new land to settle the surplus population, to provide new markets for the goods produced in the factories and mines in the empire. The empire, as I've always said, is a bread and butter question. If you want to avoid civil war, you must become an imperialist. So the capitalists at the time were understanding that you can only push your nation, your indigenous kind of working class down so much until they revolt. So the way that you can kind of avoid this is by pushing out the exploitation onto your colonial and imperialized conquest on the outside of your empire. And so at the time, though, this wasn't completely totally understood by the socialists, right? There was still a lot of debates going on inside the Socialist Party. So eventually, in the 1880s, a group of socialist parties had gotten back together and realized they needed to kind of combine forces again and created what became known as the Second International. Now, they were trying to hash out again these internal debates about what the heck was going on in the world, what was going on with capitalism, what was going on with, what was the best approach to socialism in this new kind of age. So their goal was to continue the project of the First International and carry out the work of Marx. It was dominated again by the SPD, by the German socialists, which is why, again, they're so prominent in this text. They were, again, trying to figure out this idea of what was going on with capitalist development, what was the future going to look like. There was a lot of theories about what capitalism was, what was it was going to do, and how socialists could best address this. And then they also wrestled with how to achieve socialism now that the parties had kind of stabilized, okay? So now, we've got another formation of socialist internationalists that are trying to figure out what's going on in the world. And just like the First International, they had internal debates to deal with, but the main focus of their debates was how to achieve socialism. I want to point out here, I use my photo editing skills to do this one, so you guys can also clap on that. Thank you. I'm a artist in waiting on that side of it. But so they were trying to hash out these internal conflicts, and one of the ideas was, should we be trying to reform capitalism internally, or should we be overturning the system and going for revolution, right? Because again, remember, this time capitalism is kind of stabilizing in a lot of people's eyes, right? Workers are winning concessions, and many thought you could reform this system internally, vote away capitalism, and achieve socialism step by step and avoid any bloodshed. And to be 100% fair to these guys, it wasn't completely clear. Even Engels, at the end of his life, saw reformism as a less violent. He wanted to think of a way that was, as the armies of the time were like, and technology was advancing, Engels kind of thought this will be bloodshed. This will be a slaughter if we try to overthrow these governments. The way to do it is by getting in with votes and getting in with people inside of politics. So this wasn't a completely clear-cut thing. But as people were pushing this idea of reformism, this idea of changing the system internally, one guy rose to prominence and became the leading voice of the reformist camp. And this fellow is going to be very prominent in our text. His name is Edward Bernstein. Oh, da da da. Okay, so who is Bernstein? Bernstein is. Oh, he's got to go away. See you later. All right. So Bernstein is a really interesting figure. He's one of the leading figures of the SPD, again, at the time of writing What Is to Be Done. And he's the most vocal proponent of this reformist camp, or you could call it opportunism as well. He saw Marxism as needing revising and many of Marx's theories as either wrong or mistaken. Again, he saw capitalism as kind of this like stabilizing force, as this it would eventually kind of come to this like homogeneous conclusion, and that the socialists could reform it from within. He also supported integrating a new and liberal ideas into Marxism, what he called freedom of criticism, and what Lenin is going to go freaking hard at in chapter 1 of this text. So note that for later. It's also in the glossary as we are going through this. So freedom of criticism is basically this idea that, we need to accept all ideas, all ideas about Marxism, all ideas about socialism, all ideas about revolution, about reformism are on the table, and it kind of loses the core essentials of what Marxism is and what it's supposed to be. He also encouraged, change again through the ballot box and economic reforms primarily, which is a debate we're going to talk about a little bit later. But basically, economism was this idea that we just need to promote the workers and them getting 8-hour days and them getting more workers' rights, and them and if we keep winning rights for the workers and doing more and more for the workers, eventually they're going to see their power and they're going to rise up and they're going to take power and they're going to change the government. Right? This is kind of the economist position, and Lenin has a big beef with this as well. Okay, so this basically gets us up to speed on the international scene before Lenin wrote the text. We have a lot of changes going on. We have a capitalist system that seems to be stabilizing and workers who are getting more and more organized. And you have a lot of questions about what socialists should do next. Should we just lean into the trade unions and focus all our efforts on the workers? Should we run politicians and integrate ourselves in the political system with an aim to take it over? Or should we continue to organize for a revolutionary overthrow of the system? All of these things are important topics that Lenin will be wrestling with in this text and will apply to his context in Russia. Now, before we hop into the Russian context and what the heck was going on there, we just flew through about 50 or 60 years of history. Does anybody have any questions or any clarifications before we jump into the next section? I know we have some online viewers. I've got I think Sav is maybe monitoring the chat. I don't know. So yeah, we'll if you have any questions, feel free to throw those in there as well. Okay, so no questions. All good. Good. Okay, great. So now we are gonna talk a little bit about what was going on in Russia. So in the Russian Empire prior to the writing of this text, the conditions were very different to the rest of Europe. Okay. So in Russia, we've got basically the people were dominated by a completely autocratic leader, right? The Tsar. So in a lot of European countries, you had this kind of quasi, parliamentary system with a lot of the monarchies. In some states, you had a completely kind of republican system without a monarch. In Russia, it was still 100% a monarchy and autocracy. In Russia, also, radical political movements were being hunted down by the secret police. There was no kind of plurality of thought. There was no, above-ground socialist party like they had in Germany and other places. If you were against the Tsar or against the current government, you were hunted down by the secret police. The population also was still mostly peasants, right? The economy still operated under feudalistic modes of production, which means the next point, capitalism was still very new and even non-existent in parts of the country. So the organizing and the type of theorizing that was going on in Russia at the time was completely different than the rest of Europe. So that's a context that Lenin obviously is having to take into consideration as he's writing his text and thinking about the development of Russia. Now, during this time, you have a very divided country, right? You have on one side a unbelievably wealthy and privileged class that are connected to the czar and kind of the bureaucracy in Russia, and then you also still have a side of unbelievable suffering and misery where people are still out basically working the fields with primitive tools, have very little access to medicine and education, right? So you have this very, very divided country. Now, a socialist party was founded in 1883, which we'll talk about here in a second, but they had a problem. Capitalism really hadn't developed and hadn't started developing in Russia all that much in the 1880s. So early on in kind of these radical schools of thought, you had two kind of different sides of the early radicals in the 1800s in Russia. So on one side, you had the Narodniks, and on the other side, you have the legal Marxist. Lenin talks about both in What Is to Be Done. So again, kind of tab those for later. Now, the Narodniks believed that the peasants could be a revolutionary force and like to use things like terroristic acts, like which we talked about earlier, to hopefully spur on the masses to change. Now, as you can tell by the picture, they really liked trying to blow up the czar. That was like a big part of their praxis, was like, if we can just blow up the czar, like we're gonna do it, guys. And so this was a big part of their movement, was they wanted to show people that the czar was mortal, that he wasn't a god, that he was, and so they were always trying to hatch plans to blow up or shoot the czar. But the problem with having an organization that's mostly based on very isolated organizing and terroristic acts is that it is extremely isolated and scattered, right? And so that's one side of the aisle that you have. Now, on the other side, you have the legal Marxists, who took a very different approach. They promoted the development of capitalism to get to the next stage of production. Now, if you guys have taken our Marxism 101 class or just kind of know the idea of Marxist historical progression, it's this idea that history, develops in progression. So you've got this, this slavery period of economic development, the feudalistic development of economic development, and then you have capitalism, which will go to socialism. So the legal Marxists were like, well, we just need to push capitalism as much as we possibly can, right? That's the next stage of development for us. Coincidentally, the Tsar and the early business people in Russia really liked these guys. They were like, these guys are cool. Like, they like capitalism. They want to see us develop. And so they were allowed to publish their thoughts and their writings in newspapers, in above ground newspapers, which the revolutionary socialists were not allowed to do. So that's why they're called legal Marxist. But again, and it probably won't shock a lot of people in here, but the group that mostly comprised the legal Marxists during this period eventually became the liberals during the 1917 revolution. So, who could have predicted that? Now, in the midst of this, like I said, you did have a radical revolutionary socialist organization that was led by the Russian Socialist Democratic Labor Party, which our guy Lenin was going to be a leader and figure in. There he is, right there. There you go. Always looking sharp. So the problem was that they did not. Now, unlike the legal Marxists, they didn't have the luxury of being an above-ground operation because, again, they believed in a revolutionary overturning of the government led by the workers. So the czar and the business people didn't think they were so cool. So they were getting hunted down by the secret police, and they had to publish their work. They had to publish their work in other countries or underground, and as a result, a lot of their leaders were either thrown in prison, sent to Siberia, or pushed into exile. Something, again, Josh is going to touch on here in a bit. But in the midst of all this, they were still having internal debates and talking about theory, talking about praxis, talking about how to do this damn thing IRL. And one of the sticking points at the time was what to do with the workers and the labor unions. Again, kind of what we've touched on a bit earlier. On one side, you had people who were inspired by Bernstein, who were saying that the economic struggle was enough. This is kind of the economist position that we're going to talk about. It's this idea that if you got enough workers to understand their exploitation, eventually they'll all rise up and change the system. And then on the other side of the debate, you have people like Lenin and these guys behind me who said that while the fight for reform is important, it's not enough. The workers need to understand how their exploitation is connected to all other forms of exploitation and the entire system of capitalism. The workers needed a coherent strategy and theory to understand themselves and the world around them to be most effective in their hope to change the system. So it's kind of like this idea that you can ask your boss 1,000 times for a raise, and maybe the 1,001 time he gives it to you, but why not build a system that takes away the power of the boss to give you a raise in the first place? And this is the revolutionaries' thinking. So this is the stage being set. We have a socialist movement that's in flux. We have a lot of debates about whether we should be reforming or revolutionizing the system, whether economic struggle was enough or whether we needed a broader picture. And in the midst of all this, our bold, brave, bald, beautiful king rises to the top and puts everything in context for us. And that is where we get to in our text of what is to be done. So before we get to talking about the man himself and Josh takes over, do we have any questions about all of that history that we just went over? Again, this will hopefully give you guys a good grounding for us diving into the text. And when Josh finishes, we're also going to go through the glossary and maybe answer some more questions from there. But anything initially, yeah, question in the back? Mm-hmm. Yeah. What is? Yeah. Yeah, exactly. And I think that's a good point, because one of the things that we are hopefully going to be unpacking as we go through this text together is that, history doesn't repeat itself, but sometimes it does rhyme. Sometimes there are parallels that we can kind of compare our experience to other comrades' experiences. And again, this isn't a copy and paste lesson for revolution, but it is one that we can get principles from, that we can learn lessons from, that we can extract ideas and important themes from. And so hopefully part of the process of doing this class is taking all that and applying it to what's going on right now in 2026 in this country. So, yeah, Nick.
So I just wanted to clarify, so the RSDLP, or RSDLP.
A long acronym.
Yeah.
Yeah, not very catchy.
No.
No. They came. Josh will talk a little bit more about their kind of rise. The Narodniks and the legal Marxists were separate radical movements, and the revolutionary socialists were kind of doing their own thing over here. Those were different kind of organization, different streams of kind of radicalism that were existing at the same time as the revolutionary socialists. Yeah. No, it's a good question. Anybody else have any clarifying or any other question before we jump in? Okay. Well, now Josh is going to take us in and talk about the man himself, V.I. Ulyanov.
Ulyanov, yeah. So thank you, Joe, for taking us through the development of Marxism. Oh, yeah, here, I can take that. Okay. Thank you for taking us through the development of Marxism internationally, in Russia. And so now we're going to learn a little bit about the man, the myth, the legend, who was Vladimir Lenin. So Lenin was born Vladimir Ilyich Ulyanov on April 22nd, 1870. So happy late birthday to Lenin.
Just yesterday, yeah. Happy birthday, Lenin.
He was born in Simbirsk, a provincial capital on the Volga River. It was actually later named Ulyanovsk in his honor after the revolution. The Ulyanovs were they weren't wealthy, but they were reasonably okay for their time. His father, Ilya Nikolaevich Ulyanov, rose from a family with a serf background to become a middle-class physics teacher, and his mother, Maria Alexandrovna, had also been a teacher but dedicated her time to her children. So you can see small Lenin right over here. So someone who was very important in Lenin's life was his brother, Alexander. Alexander was a serious, intelligent, and kind of model student at St. Petersburg University. they were really close and would actually they bonded over like studying together. Whenever somebody would actually disturb them, their sister would say that they would tell them to basically leave us alone. They would say, "Kindly favor us with your absence. We have to study." So they were like this. They were like study bros, you know.
Yeah, he was a early nerd.
They were nerding out
Respect.
together.
Yeah, respect.
Yeah. And in 1886, the year their father actually died, Alexander had won a gold medal for his zoological study of annelid worms. A few months later, he pawned it to buy dynamite. Or, yeah, they say a few months later, he pawned it to buy dynamite. And with 5 other students, he formed a sect of the Narodniks called the Narodnia Volia, which I believe stands for People's Will. And if you were paying attention to Joe's part, you might guess what they did next. They tried to blow up the Tsar.
They loved trying to blow up the Tsar.
Yeah,
It was their favorite. It was their favorite thing.
This was actually a couple years after they successfully blew up Tsar Alexander II, and so this time they wanted to blow up Tsar Alexander III. But unfortunately, by accident, the St. Petersburg police had accidentally discovered the plot, and Alexander was arrested, tried, and on May 8th, 1887, he and his 4 comrades were hanged. At his trial, Alexander declared, "We are encouraged to develop our intellectual powers, but we are not allowed to use them for the benefit of the people." So, he's talking about a lot of the contradictions at the time that he is experiencing, that the working class is experiencing, even the middle class who are able to attend the universities. And, although he was influenced by Narodism, and he was a member and everything, he actually tried to combine Narodnik beliefs with scientific Marxism. Actually, just before his arrest, he had translated Marx's critique of Hegel's philosophy of right, and they were study bros. So when Lenin heard about this, he immediately went to go sit down, find it, and read it. And like I said, they were close. And while the execution obviously was a very impactful event in Lenin's life, it didn't crush him. He instead it radicalized him. But as we're going to see, it radicalized him in a way that put him on a very different path from his brother. About a year after that, or actually, later that year, in August 1887, Lenin entered Kazan University to study law, but soon got involved in a student demonstration that resulted in his arrest and expulsion from the university just a couple weeks after school started. So he was exiled to his mother's old country estate in a town just outside Kazan, and was put under house arrest alongside his sister, who was under house arrest herself for being associated with their older brother's politics. And here he would plunge into his books, into his studies. It was actually around this time that he first read Capital by Karl Marx. He actually never tired of reading and rereading Marx's writings. In fact, his future wife, Nadezhda Krupskaya, would say that even in the days when Soviet power was being built, Lenin would turn to the work of Marx and often say, "Let's ask Marx's advice." And importantly, he didn't confine himself to isolated study. He actually got in contact with a illegal Marxist study group made up of revolutionary youth in Kazan, so that
Just like us, guys.
Yeah, just like us, except this is legal for now.
For now.
So, he was exiled for a little bit, but despite his police supervision and their hesitancy of allowing him back, he was eventually allowed by the authorities in 1990 to take his law exams that he studied for by himself because he couldn't attend university. And of course, being the nerd that he was, he got the highest marks in pretty much every subject. He then moved to another small town in the countryside, Samara, where he defended poor peasants. But importantly, this was always secondary to his revolutionary work. At the time, Russia and the Russian economy was changing very rapidly. Capitalism and the industrial working class were growing quickly, but these changes were not yet like sufficiently apparent on the surface of Russian life. Everyone hadn't. It was still relatively new, and everything was happening really fast. So people hadn't had time to do the proper analysis, I guess. But as he continued to study and as his theoretical foundations grew, he felt constrained by the countryside and instead wanted to move to the capital, St. Petersburg, where revolutionary thought was more active and where the industrial proletariat was waking to political life and struggle. So Lenin moved to St. Petersburg. And he got involved with a group of social democrats that called themselves the Old Men.
Something important here I want to point out too that I didn't really explain earlier. When we're talking about social democrats in this time period, that means revolutionary socialists. It's going to be a little bit of a confusion, I think, in the text as well. So it's something we put in the glossary. But anytime Lenin talks about social democrats, I know it means something different today. But social democrats in this time were the revolutionaries. So just kind of keep that in mind. So yeah, sorry, I should have talked about that earlier.
All good, thank you. Yeah. So in this group, he would he would basically become very influential and would grow to become a leader in this group. At the time before he joined, they had sort of confined themselves to propaganda circles with already conscious workers. They had not yet approached like the broad masses of workers in all the factories. But under Lenin's leadership and influence, they came to realize the necessity of conducting that sort of widespread propaganda and agitation, meeting the workers and drawing them into the active economic and political struggle. And it's important to point out both the economic and political struggle. At the time, Lenin was already aware that you can't just overstress the economic struggle alone. He instead focused on combining both this economic struggle with the political struggle against the Tsarist autocracy. During this time as well, in terms of Lenin's own development, this guy came in, he was sort of like a hotshot. He knew he had all this sort of development that he had with his brother and his study groups. But he didn't just confine himself to having the workers listen to him. He also, he listened to the workers as well. He not only taught his pupils, but he learned from them the conditions of everyday life in the factories, in the shops, in the living quarters of the workers, and he used these lessons to inform his agitation, his pamphlets, and this helped him win the hearts and the minds of the workers in the factories of St. Petersburg. He also continued to study Marxist theory as applied to Russia, which helped him in his struggle against his theoretical enemies, both the Narodniks and the legal Marxists. He particularly saw the Narodniks as underestimating capitalist development within Russia and underestimating the importance of the industrial working class as leaders of a potential future revolution. And in regards to the legal Marxists, he, as Joe was talking about, Marxism was something that was starting to spread amongst the I don't know what else to use other than intelligentsia. Yeah, it became actually really like fashionable to sort of talk in this Marxist phraseology. And Lenin did criticize this group for distorting Marxism, for advocating economism, but he also used this legal opportunity to publish his own legal articles on Marxism to get more eyes on his analysis of the situation. In the spring of 1885, he used an excuse of his prolonged recovery from a bout of pneumonia to go on a legal trip abroad to Western Europe, where he met someone named Georgy Plekhanov, who is often considered like the father of Russian Marxism, and a group that he was heading at the time called the Emancipation of Labor Group. He was making these connections. He was traveling across Europe, familiarizing himself with the struggle of the Western European working class. And as any good Marxist would do, he smuggled a bunch of really good books back with him across the border into Russia.
Oh yeah, let's go.
He actually had like a fake, like his trunk, he had like a fake bottom so that he could like hide it under there. Like, I've always wanted one of those trunks that had like a fake thing you can sort of, I don't know what I would do with it.
The best kind of smugglers are book smugglers. I'm just going to say that now.
Yeah, for sure.
Yes, yes.
And so upon his return to Russia, as the influence of the old men was growing, they actually became known as the St. Petersburg League of Struggle for the Emancipation of the Working Class. A very long,
not very catchy. Yeah,
not very catchy. Took them a little bit. Bolsheviks was like where they were starting to.
Yeah, Bolsheviks slaps. That one's a little too long.
They were working on it, but they were constantly extending their activities. Lenin began preparing to bring different social democratic organizations together to form a party congress, to sort of gather, unify, decide, their sort of theoretical foundations, and even the publication of an illegal paper that they could all rally around. However, that first issue was never released, as the materials all fell into the hands of the state when Lenin and much of the leadership of the old men were arrested in December 1895. This is actually Lenin's mugshot, which goes pretty hard, I think.
Dude. Love that.
So, yeah, in prison, Lenin was still drafting the program for this future party. He also began to collect materials to conduct this sort of like economic investigation of capitalism in Russia at the time. That was to form the sort of analytical, theoretical basis of the program for this future party. And at the same time, he also continued to supply comrades on the outside with materials for pamphlets and leaflets and such. There was actually a strike wave that occurred in the summer of 1896 within St. Petersburg, and despite being behind bars, Lenin was active in writing and sending out appeals to the workers of factories, urging them to continue their strike and to not give up. These strikes actually frightened the Tsar so much that his government adopted the first piece of factory legislation, which limited the working day to 11 and a half hours.
So nice. That was really nice of him.
Yeah, 11 and I mean,
maybe the Tsar wasn't so bad.
Who can't do 11 and a half hours?
Yeah, come on.
So after about I want to say like a year and a half or so in prison, he is eventually exiled again. This time they decide probably a little bit further away is better, so they exile him to Siberia. During his time there, he made close connections with the local peasants, partly because he went to law school. He was a lawyer, so he was advising them on legal matters for free, which was probably very helpful. But more importantly, he continued his economic investigation. This investigation would actually later culminate in one of his most important scientific works, which was the development of capitalism in Russia. He also wrote a number of articles on the program, strategy, and tactics of revolutionary struggle. He was able to actually smuggle these out of the country where they could get published, printed, and then smuggled back in for distribution. So they had this whole network of getting things in and out, despite him being far apart from his other comrades. Before I actually continue, this is the room where he was this is the house where he lived for most of his exile. This is actually, from my understanding, the hunting rifle he would use when he would go out hunting. This is potentially the desk where he wrote about his investigation. Who knows? But yeah, so this is sort of like a museum now in Russia, which I found really interesting.
Isn't this where he got his pen name from too? There was like the Lena River that was close by.
Oh,
I think
yeah,
that's
yeah,
it,
yeah. So there was a river close by called the Lena River. That's where he got like Lenin from. But yeah. So, during Lenin's 3 years in exile, I believe he returned in February of 1990. The working class movement had grown greatly, but he found that the leadership was lacking at the time in regards to unifying the social democrats in Russia. There had been there had been a first Congress of the Russian Social Democratic Labor Party that had taken place, but they didn't. It was just a formal unification. They hadn't established any sort of theoretical grounding. They were all still sort of doing their own thing. And so Lenin wanted to bring them all together under like a shared analysis, a shared foundation and grounding. So while in exile, he was still cooking up this idea that he had before being arrested, which was to create a national paper to rally around. So in the summer of 1900, after talking with some comrades, putting some stuff into motion, he goes abroad again, and with the help of the Emancipation of Labor group that I've spoken about previously, they come around to establishing two printed organs. One of them is a theoretical magazine called the Zaraya. The other, most importantly, was the Iskra newspaper. The first, and so some of you might have heard of that. Lenin was sort of part of the editorial board. A lot of his theoretical and analytical writings were to be printed in that paper.
Yeah.
And
both of those papers are going to talk. Lenin will talk about in the text and what is to be done. So it's important to kind of keep that tab for later.
And so the first issue of Iskra was published in December 1990. In this issue, he defended the principles of revolutionary Marxism from all the sort of attacks or encroachments that had been made on it. Specifically, he was sort of fighting on two fronts. He was fighting to his right, the economists who wanted to degrade the movement to purely an economic struggle. And then to his left, he was fighting those who were still being influenced by the Narodniks, who saw terrorism as a activity or as a method of everyday social democratic activity and work. But really importantly, Lenin wanted to make Iskra more than just a paper. He wanted it to be an organizing center of the party and put a lot of work towards that goal. In fact, he had representatives and agents in cities all over Russia. These represented some of the first Leninist cadres who carried out locally the Leninist policy on chief questions as it pertains to theory and tactics and the strategy of revolutionary struggle. Its influence spread as more individual social democrats began to group and rally around the Iskra, sort of accomplishing that goal of unifying everybody under the same sort of theoretical grounding. So that it's about 1900. By 1902, this would lead to the publishing of What Is to Be Done. This text would play a tremendously large role in acting as a guide to action for a vast majority of social democratic organizations in Russia, and would obviously be very fundamental in the revolution that would come in 1917 and the establishment of the Soviet Union.
Yeah.
So yeah, that
Very
is
good.
where we'll
So
leave it with that.
I know this was a lot of information, and I know that's a lot of historical background. Some of it might seem confusing, contradictory, but hopefully as we continue to go through this text, you guys will understand kind of the importance of all this and why, we thought it was good to kind of hash this out before you dive into the text. So part of that process is going through all this historical material, but the other part is also our glossary that we're going to go through. So before we jump into glossary, any questions about all of that we just covered, from internationalism to the Russian, for Lenin's kind of specific situation? So, we got a microphone.
Oh, okay. Thank you. I'm actually more curious about your guys' history with this work and the work that you do here, just because it's my first time being here, first time being a part of the book studies, but you've obviously done these before. So I'm just curious about why you guys are doing this and why you guys chose this.
Yeah, so this is a kind of left-wing socialist Marxist organizing space. So we leverage the relationships that we build across the city. We have a wide variety of kind of things that we do with the organization. We have education that we do like this. We have our food distributions that we do on the weekends. We have our free medical clinic. We have a gardening a community group that goes out and does community gardening. We kind of see our role as helping to build kind of class consciousness and political consciousness in Los Angeles and far afield as we possibly can. So we are live streaming this event. Hopefully there's some people watching. So part of our goal, hopefully, is to continue to popularize some of these ideas that maybe have gotten pushed down through history and just continue to make these more accessible for the average person in our community and beyond. So I think that's kind of our broad goal that we're hoping to achieve here. And we thought What Is to Be Done is one of the first and one of the kind of most foundational texts that kind of started this kind of socialist Marxist kind of theorizing. And so we thought it was a really good one for us to start out with. But this won't be the last one. We're going to keep building from here. So hopefully you stay plugged in with that. So, yeah.
Josh, you mentioned that this might not matter that much. Or it probably doesn't. But Alexander was killed by the Tsar after they accidentally found his plans. Like, how did they just come across that? I'm curious.
I'm not exactly sure the specific circumstances. From what I understand is, I believe there was some sort of, the police happened to stumble across them, some sort of organizing that they had been doing, whether that was like the dynamite that they were gathering or something like that. I don't know the specific details of how that happened. But yeah, sorry, I don't have the.
That's fine.
Any other? Oh, one more in the back.
So in terms of just the sheer number of people who are part of these movements at this time, like I know there's Narodniks and the Economists, and they're putting stuff in newspapers, so it sounds like there's enough people that it's like somewhat widespread.
Yeah.
Are there a lot of other people who are sympathetic to what Lenin is about to lay out and what is to be done, or is he kind of like going it alone at this point?
Well, I would say that these movements are still relatively kind of fringe movements because it's still, you got to remember the context that they're organizing in. It's very hostile to anything that's against the Tsar. And so, and the majority of the population in Russia is still rural and in kind of peasantry. So these are organizations and movements that are mostly located in St. Petersburg and Moscow, and mostly kind of confined to middle class and kind of, intelligentsia, college educated type people. But so I would say, the early movements like the Narodniks and like the legal Marxists were the ones that probably had the most momentum at the time. But as Marxism was continuing to gain momentum, the early Marxists were, like Josh was talking about, Marxism kind of became fashionable in like the 1880s and the 1890s. So it was becoming more of a prominent thing in those kind of social circles. And so the time that Lenin wrote this, it is becoming more of a prominent thing. There's a lot of competing newspapers, and that's one thing Lenin's going to be. As soon as you start chapter 1, Lenin's jumping straight into beef with like 2 or 3 newspapers, just like on site, not explaining anything, not giving you any context. So that is part of the thing, is that there's a lot of competing ideas, a lot of competing newspapers and movements, and Lenin is just kind of one of many voices at the time that are trying to kind of hash out the future for Russia and for the people. But yeah, this is a good question. Anybody else? These are good questions. Appreciate you guys. Yeah, one more vote. I can hear. Yeah.
I'm curious if you know anything more about how little Lenin became kind of radicalized, because it just seems so interesting to me that he's in kind of this like middle class family, and then it sounds like maybe the brothers were just like reading and studying together and sort of radicalized each other. Like, what's the vibe?
I'll let Josh answer too, but I also, from when I was studying too, Lenin always, he seemed to have a rebellious spirit from an early age. I think this was part of his kind of personality and temperament. So I think he had this kind of just innate aversion to authority that kind of started at an early age. And so I think that started it. And then obviously the influence of his brother and just what was going on in Russia and the violence and the oppression of the Tsar that he was able to see, I think also kind of was a part of the radicalization. Do you have anything?
Like I was saying, like they were very studious. They loved to study a lot. They were, my understanding is that they were sort of exposed to a lot of different, not only events happening in Western Europe, like reading about it, like whether that was the revolutions of like 1848 or the Paris Commune or anything like that. And so, these sort of historical examples, like Joe was saying at the beginning of the presentation, Engels was still alive, like at this time. Like there was still, people and organizations discussing this. So especially as people coming from middle class backgrounds who had access to that sort of university education, I think they were exposed to a lot of that growing up.
Yeah, and I think like Lenin was like 13 or 14 when Marx died. So like this was all very like contemporary what was going on. And I will say that, the one kind of key thread from Lenin to all the revolutionary history, the one thing that kind of ties them all together is they all read. They were all they were into reading. Reading is the one thing that is, going to tie all these revolutionaries together. And so you guys are in good company here tonight. So we got one more. I think we can probably swing.
Yeah, just definitely the reading is important, but there is that privilege with the reading, right? Because the peasantry was rural, right? And there wasn't access to education along with medical care and all that other stuff, correct? Yeah. So, that's important. And I was gonna, at least kind of, point that out, but then also recognize, and I'm sure we're gonna get into it as the weeks progress, but what changed that, or what was the catalyst for the peoples, the rural peoples, to revolution, to of course listen to the educated or the persons that are more reading and not fall into the fashion of it, right? In that regard, or amongst those circles of the what could be considered the elite or the privileged, not fall into the fashion of oh look, Marxism, right? So
Yeah, no, and it's a good observation. And I think one of the things that Lenin is going to talk about in this text is the idea that he understands that the role of the intellectual Marxist is a role of privilege, and that you need to use that privilege to educate the people, and that part of our roles as educated people is to make Marxism, make socialism, make popular movements as understandable as possible for the population, because what he's going to talk about in this text is the idea that we need kind of an organized political movement so that we can go out and educate and talk to the people that are having to work 12, 14 hours a day, that don't have time to sit and read, that maybe aren't literate, that don't have that access to that education and those things. So he's seeing the idea of leveraging the intellect, leveraging the ability to read, leveraging all the education that these people have to be able to reach out and help the people, and that the intelligentsia kind of class is a revolutionary class in that sense, that it's part of being able to spread that. And eventually, when they do the Russian Revolution, they go from a country that has a 20% literacy rate to a country that has nearly 100% literacy rate less than 30 years later. So they did achieve those goals. So, all right. Well, really great question, guys. I really appreciate that. But we are going to try to be conscious of time. So the next thing we're going to do is we are going to hop into our glossary. So the goal here is I'm just going to read through the terms, and you guys can make any notes.
Does
Yeah.
anybody need one?
Oh, yeah.
Is
Do
anyone
we-
missing? We printed out a few extra copies.
Okay.
Okay, I'll bring
One
one over
more.
there. Is there anyone else? Okay, I got it.
Okay, thank you so much for that. So what we're going to do, we're just going to read through these terms, just kind of clarify anything. So if you, we've talked about several of these. Some of these we haven't talked about. But the idea, again, of this glossary is all of these names are in here are mentioned multiple times. So if you are reading through the text and you're like, what the heck? Who was that Bernstein guy again? I can't remember. I know he was scary from Joe's part of the presentation, but what was his deal? You can go to the glossary and reference it, and that way it can hopefully help you guys as you're understanding this kind of very historically situated text. Okay, so we're going to just read through these quick, and then if you guys have any questions or need any clarifications, let us know. I'm going to read through the Narodnin Volya section, Josh. Okay, so first we have Bernstein, Edward. One of the main sources of Lenin's frustration throughout the text, Bernstein represented the reformist camp of international socialism. He advocated for small, gradual steps towards change and saw the ballot box as the best hope for socialists to gain power, something Lenin saw as a revisionist dead end. The Bund, a secular Jewish socialist party that advocated for economism and Jewish workers' rights. The Bund wanted to be independent of mainstream Russian Socialist Party, something Lenin opposed in favor of strict party unity. The Credo Program, a manifesto written by Russian socialist E.D. Kustanov. The Credo promoted focusing on economic issues solely, so again, economism, which is going to come up several times, the equality of all opinions inside the party, freedom of criticism, which we talked about earlier, and aligned strongly with Bernstein's vision of socialism. Now, economism, the big one. You guys can highlight this, put a star by it. This is going to be a big one just for us to be thinking about. One of the primary ideas that Lenin is trying to combat in this text, economism or trade union consciousness, claims that the socialist organizer only needs to promote the spontaneous will of the worker and their economic improvement, fighting for better wages and working conditions. They saw theoretical discussion as liberal bourgeois distractions and thought that the revolutionary class consciousness would emerge naturally from the workers' economic battles with their bosses. Again, an idea that Lenin's going to have some beef with. Next is freedom of criticism, another important one. This is basically what the whole chapter 1 is about. So another target of Lenin's frustration, this idea was promoted by The Economist as free debate inside the party. Inspired by Bernstein, who was reinterpreting Marxism and questioning many of Marx's ideas and observations, Lenin argues that this isn't an invitation for open debate, but a way to slip in non-revolutionary ideas into the party and undermine the progress of the workers. Now, next one, Iskra. This is the one Josh talked about. A Russian revolutionary newspaper founded in 1900 by Lenin and other revolutionaries in exile, the main source of quote-unquote orthodox Russian revolutionary Marxism during the period. Next, Karl Kautsky, one of the leaders of the German Socialist Party, the SPD, and one of the main opponents of Bernstein during that time. Kautsky promoted the importance of theory in the party and adherence to Marx's idea of the dictatorship of the proletariat and the necessity of revolutionary activity. Ferdinand Lassalle, a unique figure in socialist history. Lassalle was a contemporary of Marx and started the first socialist workers' party in Germany. Lenin quotes Lassalle several times to combat the ideas of economism and freedom of criticism. Next, legal Marxism, who we talked about again, a branch of Russian Marxism that published their works in legal newspapers. They advocated for the acceptance and rapid development of capitalism, seen as the next stage of development, usually advocating for economism, and were seen as mostly harmless and even beneficial by the Tsarist government, which is why they were legal. William Liebknecht, one of the founders of the German Socialist Party. Alexander Miratonov, one of the leading figures of economism inside Russian socialism. Now you have Alexander Millerand, the center of this is an interesting guy. He's the center of controversy during the Second International that later became known as the Millerand Affair. He accepted a post in 1899 in the French bourgeois government as Minister of Commerce, even though one of the leading figures in the government was Gaston Auguste, the commander and architect of the slaughter of the Paris Commune. Is it too dark?
No, we added.
Oh, cool. I sent. Okay, yeah, that's good. Thank you. Yeah, so in case you're following along at home and don't have access to the glossary, that was a good idea. So Millerand accepted a post in 1899 in the French bourgeois government as Minister of Commerce, even though one of the leading figures of the government was Gaston Auguste, the commander and architect of the slaughter of the Paris Commune. This action created a huge rift and debate in the Second International and eventually even split the French socialist movement in 1902. In chapter 1, Lenin talks about the mountain and the Gironde. It's a reference to the factions in the French Revolution. The mountain represented the radical left of the movement, which Lenin saw as similar to the revolutionary Marxists, and the Gironde, which was the moderate and centrist faction in the Russian Revolution, which Lenin compared to the reformist and the economist. And then you have the Narodnya Volya, or the Narodniks, which we've talked about several times now, a radical movement inside of Russia that emphasized the revolutionary potential of the peasantries, peasant communes, and saw terrorism or terroristic acts as a way to activate and inspire the masses. Okay, Josh, you want to take it?
Yeah. Next we have
Nadezhdin.
Nadezhdin.
Yeah, there we
Okay. He was a leader of the Svoboda group, who was a target of criticism by Lenin throughout what is to be done. This group sort of advocated a lot of like economism and like terrorist actions. Next is opportunism. So opportunism is the subordination of revolutionary politics and goals to the immediate, narrow, and short-term gains. It's the theory and practice of basically following the path of least resistance or adapting to the existing order rather than destroying it. See Millerand.
Yeah, the Millerand affair is a good example of opportunism in action as far as that goes. So you can get back on that.
Georgy Plekhanov, as we discussed in the presentation, he was considered the father of Russian Marxism and a founder of the Emancipation of Labor Group, the first Marxist organization in Russia. His works were an inspiration to a generation of revolutionaries, including Lenin, who he helped to found Iskra while in exile. He would eventually break from Lenin and the Bolsheviks over their organizational principles, which he saw as overly centrist, and became a leading figure of the Mensheviks. This is when we start to get into the newspapers. You're going to hear a ton about.
You'll see Rabotchia in your dreams if you're reading this text, because there's several Rabotchia newspapers. Which Rabotchia just means like workers, in case you're wondering. So that's why all the newspapers are called Rabotchia something, because it's just talking about the workers.
Yeah. So Rabotchia Dielo was a social democratic Russian newspaper founded in 1899 that served as the official organ of the Union of Russian Social Democrats Abroad. They were frequently a target of Lenin's criticisms for their economist stance. Rabotchia Gazeta, a social democratic Russian newspaper founded in 1897, which was meant to serve as an organ of the Russian Social Democratic Labor Party. It only published 2 issues before the leadership of the RSDLP was arrested and its printing press was destroyed, but Lenin still talks about it in the text. Rabotchia Misl was another Russian newspaper founded in 1897 that served as a proponent of the economist current within the movement, and surprise, surprise, a frequent target of Lenin's criticisms in the book.
Lenin's got beef with everybody. You guys gotta watch out.
Yeah, no, this whole book is just Lenin having beef with people. It's really great. He really knows how to like slam dunk on them. It's really fun.
Yeah, there's some good one-liners in there for sure.
Next, we have a social democracy, which was, as Joe went over earlier, that was the name that was used to describe revolutionary Marxism at that time. While the term would later develop a different meaning, Lenin used it to describe the fusion of the working class movement with socialism, bringing political consciousness to the struggle of the workers. We have spontaneity, which is that's the form in which the revolutionary movement first appears among the working class, but which alone is insufficient for actual revolution.
There's a few chapters on this as well, so I would kind of highlight this one as just one to kind of internalize as best you can.
According to Lenin, spontaneity by itself can only lead to trade union consciousness, which I guess is also something that's in the text. I don't know if we went over that, but so basically a desire for better deals under capitalism, and it must be paired with revolutionary theory and organization to actually develop socialist consciousness. Next is Svoboda, a revolutionary group in 1901 that Lenin criticized as being reckless in their advocacy of terrorism and lack of revolutionary discipline. The next term we have is tailism, which is the practice of following behind the spontaneous movement of. Oh, sorry, changing it.
Is it another slide?
It's another slide. Yeah. Okay.
Cool.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Tailism, which is the practice of following behind the spontaneous movement of the working class, rather than leading the movement. In the case of tailism, the Revolutionary Party instead acts as its tail or its rear, simply registering and responding to whatever the economic struggles the worker happened to be engaged in at the moment. More reactive than being proactive. Next is the Union of Russian Social Democrats Abroad. This was basically just an organization of immigrant Russian socialists that served as the representatives of the RSDLP overseas, abroad in like Western Europe. It would later become controlled by the Economist by the publication of What Is to Be Done, which is why you might see Lenin going after them a bit. Next, as I mentioned earlier, Zaraya, a Russian Marxist theoretical journal founded in 1901. It served as a companion to Iskra because they shared like an editorial board. However, it was short-lived due to disagreements among the board, particularly between Lenin and Planktonov, which would serve as like a precursor to the Bolshevik-Menshevik split later on. Zemstov was a system of local self-government introduced by the Russian Empire in 1864 as part of like these like great reforms that Tsar Alexander II, the one who did get bombed or blown up, Zemstov liberals sort of created their own movement that merely just wanted the Tsar to sort of enact these reforms rather than the revolution that Lenin and his fellow socialists wanted to bring about. And then finally, we have Sergei Zubetov, okay, a Russian police commissioner who he sort of just saw the Social Democrats winning over workers and spreading these socialist ideas and thought to reduce their influence by instead creating legal state-sanctioned workers' unions that were loyal to the Tsar, so like fake unions, essentially.
Okay, so let's all take a deep breath. All right. So I promise this text is not that hard to understand. There's just a lot of historical background, and we want everybody to get as much out of it as you can. And if you're like me and you're reading a text and somebody keeps talking about something that you don't understand, you just put the book down, you go and Google it, you wait. So we're just hoping to speed this process up to give you guys a little bit more of a background and understanding of what is going on so that when we get to the text, we can actually understand what is to be done. Now, from that glossary, we kind of, obviously there's going to be a lot of stuff in there that we haven't talked about yet, but is there any clarifications of maybe stuff we did talk about or anything that we want to maybe clarify just from those definitions before we get started? Yannick?
This is so nitpicky. I'm just curious. There's 3 different Rabashaya, which you were talking about.
Yeah.
Why is one of them spelled with 2 E's and all the other ones are 2 A's?
I think it's just the way that the Russian works. I think it's like gendered kind of, and so it has kind of like a different Englishization or whatever. But yeah, I think that's kind of how that works.
Learn something new every day.
Yeah, there you go. Anything else? Okay. Oh yeah.
Could you go over the Zemstov a little bit more? Did we talk about that earlier?
We didn't talk about, and it's not going to come up till probably later. But it was kind of an early, kind of liberal organization that Tsar Alexander II kind of came up with. It was like these kind of, I don't know, like councils, local councils, basically that kind of worked in tandem with the Tsarist government to try to kind of do some kind of moderate reforms and stuff, basically so people wouldn't keep blowing him up, because he really wanted to stop getting blowed up. That was his main goal, was like, please stop blowing me up, guys. So he did these kind of liberal reforms and built stuff like this out. So yeah.
Yeah, think of them kind of like city or like neighborhood councils, but obviously it didn't work because Tsar Alexander II still got blown up anyways.
He tried, but he still got blown up. So anyways. Yeah, one more in the back.
Who actually read all these newspapers? Is it mostly educated, like, I guess, bourgeois, for lack of a better term, folks, or were the working class also reading them?
Well, I mean, obviously, in the Russian Empire at the time, probably 1/5 of the population was literate. So it was not. It was literacy in newspapers was still a kind of middle class, upper middle class, kind of in the czarist bureaucracy and above that were kind of reading these newspapers. So it was kind of very much a in the city centers that these newspapers were kind of being circulated, but they were trying to build, Lenin's big vision, and something he'll talk about in this text, is building kind of a nationwide newspaper and building literacy more broadly so that the workers and the peasants can have more access to information about what's going on. So
I actually think at the time, like, a lot of these papers were also like illegal, so they had to be like. Yeah, they had to be smuggled in. You could sort of you could get them if like you knew the right person, right? Like, sort of people are organizing and sort of to guide them ideologically and theoretically and stuff. So you kind of had to be in the know a little bit. But yeah.
So outside of like the legal Marxists who were publishing in above ground newspapers, a lot of these were kind of circulated among kind of smaller, radical groups at the time. So yeah. Any other questions? I think I saw another hand over here, maybe.
Can you speak at all, just a little bit, to what differentiates opportunism and tailism? They seem like maybe they're both like short-term focused and like following the working class. So I was just wondering I don't know if that's part of like the reading, but
yeah. You said about opportunism and tailism?
Yes.
Okay, so opportunism is this idea of kind of like taking advantage of a specific circumstance for maybe personal advancement, or maybe taking advantage of a certain thing so that and not really thinking about the long-term implication of it. So that Millerand affair is a good example where somebody took a role in a bourgeois government and kind of saw it as a way to advance their own kind of personal brand or their own personal goals, and they kind of justified it as like, I'm doing something for the revolution, but a lot of the revolutionaries saw it as a betrayal of kind of their ideals and working with this government and not really doing anything not really having a underlying theory that was backing this action. It was just more of taking the opportunity that presented themselves. And so that's more opportunism. And do you want to talk about tailism, since that was yours?
Yeah. So like tailism, it's kind of like, I think I spoke to it earlier as being reactive rather than proactive. So in some ways, it is almost similar in the way that it's sort of like a path of least resistance a little bit, but it is more so it's focused more on like following the spontaneous movement, right? Like more aligned with like spontaneity, with sorry, my mind blanked, but yeah, basically that.
And it's kind of this idea that basically like whatever the masses are doing, like that's what we're doing. So it's like, oh, today they're protesting for a 8-hour workday. That's what we're going to support. Tomorrow they're protesting for, safe work conditions. That's what instead of having kind of an underlying theory and vision and goal and kind of like a program that you're putting together and an ideology that you're trying to follow, it's more just like kind of following whatever is happening. And in Lenin, that's something that Lenin is going to kind of talk about in this text as well. So yeah, very good questions. We got one more in the back, and then maybe need to wrap up.
I mean, because I think I've been checked before regarding the freedom of criticism, not here, but in other spaces.
Yeah.
And it's interesting because Lenin is criticizing Bernstein, who's pretty much the opportunist, reformist, vote, vote, right?
Right.
Like that focus. And this is what, I'm glad thank you for clarifying earlier. Like, yeah, well, history didn't repeat itself, but it definitely rhymes, and there's a lot of rhyming. And I'm not going to put names out there, politicians, orgs, or nothing.
Sure.
People can come up with their own that are in the know, and then also that others are learning. You'll pick up on this. Like,
right.
You'll see what's happening. This is what I mean. Like, where are we at? Where have things been? And where, and what is the end goal, which should be this, but
right.
ultimately it's not, right?
Yeah.
Or at least not right now or anytime soon.
Yeah, and I think one of the things that Lenin is trying to do in this text, and I think an important thing that we want to be doing through this study, is defining what is Marxism. because like Marxism kind of gets thrown around a lot today, right? Like Kamala Harris is a Marxist and the Pope is a Marxist and like everybody's a Marxist if you criticize America. And it's just like we need to really clearly define what is Marxism, what is socialism, and what are our goals and what is the goals of this program. And this is something that Lenin was doing during his time and something that we should be trying to do during our time as well. Yeah. Another one?
Yeah, just curious about how international this movement was, because I know Rosa Luxemburg also wrote Reform or Revolution around this time, and just how international they were keeping.
Yeah, so I mean, obviously international is a little limited in this situation because it is mostly like the Eastern, Western European countries, Russia. There were some representatives from like Ireland and from South America that came to the Second International. I think the United States had some representation, but yeah, Rosa Luxemburg was a big part of the Second International, big part of the SPD of the German Socialist Party, but that's unfortunately a little bit beyond the scope of this class. But yeah, for sure, it's a broad movement, and again, it's something that they're thinking about at the time and seeing capitalism continue to expand and grow into an international monster, and they're like, we need international organization to be able to fight that. And so there's all kinds of voices from all kinds of languages and countries and cultures and backgrounds that are contributing to this theory and this background. So yeah, good deal. Anybody else? Okay, so I do want to be conscious of time. We did have like a little kind of fun 10, 15-minute discussion that we were going to do at the very end. It is 8:38. We put 8:30 on the flyer for the event. So if anybody needs to leave, nobody will be upset. But I would like to maybe just do a short little kind of 10, 15-minute discussion. And what I want to do is I want to remember this class after tonight is going to be led by you guys. Okay, you, the readers, are going to be bringing in your own observations, bringing in your questions, bringing in your own ideas, trying to figure out how to apply this stuff to our real life conditions. So what I'd like for us to do is maybe circle up in groups of 5 or 6 and let's kind of get to know each other a little bit. So we had a few questions. I think we'll just keep it to like 1 or 2 tonight. So the first question we have is find a group and tell that group a little bit about yourself as much as you're comfortable sharing, and maybe kind of what got you to come out to this class in the first place. What interested you about studying this text, about coming to this event, and what are you hoping to get out of it? So kind of let's circle up a little bit. Let's go through that question, and then we'll maybe jump into the last one to wrap us up. So, okay. Go. Don't want to interrupt you guys, but for anybody watching online, we are going to be shutting down the stream. So if you are studying with a group, thank you for attending. You guys can do your discussion amongst yourselves. If you are watching by yourself, maybe kind of journal through or think through some of these questions, and we hope you can find some more people to continue to read with and grow with. But thank you guys so much for joining us online, and you guys here in the store can continue your discussion. So, thank you.